do in this talk is engage with some recent critiques of social constructivism and put forward my own account and argue that this avoids those critiques and demonstrates a kind of new way, or maybe at least somewhat novel way of thinking about how social construction relates to terms or ideas in metaphysics and philosophy of science, such as physical construction and emergence. Okay, so I'll get going. So why do I want to do this talk? Why do I think it's important? So, of course, I don't think anyone listening to this needs to be told that calling a kind socially constructed plays a really important role in contemporary political discourse. That is, it plays a function, particularly if we focus on racial kinds, saying that race is a social construct, can debunk racialist claims and help explain why, notwithstanding the falsity or falsehood of kind of essentialist claims, explain why racial categories can be successfully used in a bunch of, say, social scientific or maybe medical explanations. So it's worth understanding, therefore, given that it plays this important political role, and given that the kind of philosophers such as Garcia and Hardimon who've written critiques of social constructivism don't disagree with that kind of political role, why is it that they want to critique these claims of social constructivism? And so insofar as their critiques are worthwhile, I think they've got something to them, it's worth understanding the sense in which one can still be a social constructivist and grant some of their objections. So that's part of the motivation. So the aim is to develop an account of social construction, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to argue that on this account there is a strong analogy between social construction and physical construction. In particular, both may be seen as kinds of ontological emergence. So an upshot of my account is that the critiques of social construction just mentioned are undermined, so Hardimon and Garcia's critiques are undermined, but social constructivism about such kinds in general, what I want to claim is that this shouldn't be an area of philosophical controversy. So I think what's really important, and I think there are crucial philosophical projects involved in understanding the mechanisms for social construction, understanding which particular societal structures are responsible for social construction in the way in which I'll talk about. But I don't think that social construction itself, about many kinds, and in particular racial kinds, should be something that is controversial at all. And what I'm going to suggest is that the particular account of social construction that I'm defending here is one that should make clear just how social constructivism sort of sits at the intersection of lots of different ways of thinking about social kinds. Okay. So, debates about the defining properties of particular kinds, and I'm going to say more about what that means in a minute, turn out to be orthogonal to debates about whether or not such kinds are socially constructed. So, where one finds, such as in the recent book by Glasgow, Haslanger, Jeffers, and Spencer, What is Race? It's seen as if social construction is one of the options, one of the metaphysical options that can be understood as providing a metaphysics for race. I think that's a mistake. I think that all of the authors in that book agree that there's a common sense in which race is socially constructed. However, they disagree on what the defining properties for racial kinds are. So what I want to do, what I think is the important upshot of the account that I'm defending, is that the metaphysical claims about what the defining properties are for particular kinds can come apart from whether such kind is socially constructed. Okay, so what's the account? This is it. Property P is socially constructed if and if only if social structures or facts are responsible for P's salience to scientific explanation. So what's crucial, what does the relevant work in the project that I've just outlined, is that we're focusing on P's or a property or a kind's salience to scientific explanations rather than its constitution or its causal history. So we're not talking about the kind itself or the property itself. We're talking about the reason that it's relevant, the reason it's salient, the reason that it plays a role in scientific explanations. So one can then sort of go on and flesh this out. If the properties associated with the kind are socially constructed, the kind may counter socially constructed. However, a kind may be socially constructed, and this is what's important, even if its defining properties aren't social. So what I'm doing, as I said, I'm pulling apart defining properties of a kind from what it means to say that it's socially constructed. If a kind is socially constructed, then social structures make its defining properties, whatever they are, salient to usually social scientific explanations. Okay, so to sort of flesh this out further, consider the view that Hardimon has that membership of a race is determined, at least to some extent, or at least in part, by fairly recent ancestry. So to say that an individual is white or black is a way of talking about where their fairly recent ancestors came from. Okay, so this is a populationist account of race. I don't want to defend this account. I think that there are salient objections to it, and I'm not sure this is a place to be defending, and I don't want to do that in this talk. In fact, I think I'm probably a pluralist in general about the defining properties of racial kinds. But let's say we grant to Hardimon for now that populationist race is a right way of understanding what race is. Assuming racialism is false, absent social structures of racial oppression, populationist racial membership would be irrelevant to the explanation of pretty much any social outcome. So even if it's the case that the defining properties of racial kinds are these kind of populationist groups or can be spelt out in terms of fairly recent ancestry, that doesn't amount to the claim that racial kinds play the explanatory roles that they do because of these kind of populationist facts. So the fact that, say, racial kinds are useful for social scientific explanations is because of oppressive social structures. So that's the sense in which, and I think it's an important sense, it's to say the key sense of social construction in general, is that racial kinds are useful for social scientific explanations only because of oppressive social structures. Populationist racial kinds, even if racial kinds are populationist, they are still socially constructed because social structures are the things that are responsible for those kinds' salience of scientific explanations. So that's kind of the whole account, right? Whatever the defining properties of racial kinds are, or the defining properties of any kinds are, those kinds can still be socially constructed if social structures are responsible for their salient scientific explanations. This account of social construction, I think, is a good one. It fits certain intuitive criteria. So Diaz-Leon argues that in order for something to count as socially constructed, or an account to be an account of social construction, it should explain the historical contingency and non-universality of the socially constructed property or kind. That seems to work in this case. If current and past social structures are responsible for the explanatory salience of, say, racial properties or kinds, then that underwrites their non-universality and their historical contingency. In a counterfactual history, if history were to have turned out differently, and the structures responsible for such salience were lacking, or in other times and places which lacked such structures, then the kinds lose their salient scientific explanation, and they no longer count as socially constructed. Socially constructed kinds on this account lose their salient scientific explanations. I think it's important though, and I think a useful upshot of this account is that not all kinds are socially constructed. Take the kind neutrino, take the entities neutrinos, or the property being a neutrino. My view is, and this takes a kind of realist account of scientific explanation in the background, is that these kinds maintain their salient scientific explanation irrespective of the social structures. That's the sense in which this isn't, such kinds aren't socially constructed, whereas other kinds are. So it's not that everything is socially constructed, which I think is useful. Okay, so this is built very significantly. I draw a huge amount from the account of Ásta, particularly in the book Categories We Live By. Ásta's account is in line with my own, far more in line with my own than Haslanger's, with which I sort of disagree to some extent. In fact, the way she talks about social construction and social significance could be a slogan for my account. Individuals have properties, but it's in virtue of social construction those properties attain their social significance. So Ásta says for a feature B to have social significance, it's for another feature F to be conferred upon people taken to have B. So she has this same kind of idea of base properties and conferred properties. Okay, so just to finish that, I think that the only difference between myself and Ásta is that she presumes that we need this kind of extra level of conferred properties. I'm not sure we need that. I think the base properties can have social significance in some contexts, not social significance in another context, without going via the conferred properties. Okay. So, defending this account by analogy, the idea is that social construction isn't this kind of special thing with respect to which those people who are a bit skeptical of social science, or those people who are worried about certain political ways of seeing the world, think of social construction as therefore suspect. I don't think it should be understood as suspect. I think it shouldn't be understood as suspect precisely because the mechanisms by which structures become responsible for kind salience in particular contexts is exactly that which we find in physics. Is exactly that which we find in other areas of science where we find similar kinds of construction. So construction is generic, and social construction should be far less controversial. So if we think about physics for a second, we can think about, say, viscosity or compressibility. Say viscosity is how quickly or slowly a liquid or a fluid flows. Or compressibility, how much the volume of a solid will change under pressure. So now, one might think that the viscosity for a given material may be definable whatever its phase, whether it's liquid or solid. But its viscosity is only particularly salient for physical explanations when it's structured as a liquid. When it's structured as a solid, its viscosity is somewhat irrelevant to scientific explanation. So if you grant me that, we can see that it is the presence of the structure, liquid or solid, and the presence of the environmental conditions, temperature or pressure, which are responsible for the salience of viscosity or compressibility to scientific explanation. That's just the same way as social construction happens. So imagine that there's a kind of society that's zodiacist, that has kind of systems of discrimination based on one's zodiac sign. In such a society, zodiac sign, whatever the underlying property is, whether this is what month you're born in or the alignment of stars or whatever else, that particular defining property for zodiac sign is salient for explanation because of the zodiacist structures present in society. Likewise, in a society like ours, insofar as there's systemic racism or structural racism or oppression of various different kinds, then these kinds play their role in certain kinds of explanation precisely because of the existence of such oppressive structures. So, physically structures or socially structures can be responsible for the salience of various kinds to scientific explanations. Okay. In the presence of different physical structures, different underlying properties become salient to scientific explanations. Viscosity is physically constructed because it's only when the system is structured as a liquid that its viscosity when liquid is relevant for explanations. Likewise, the presence of social structures based on race or oppression determine underlying properties of salient scientific explanations. So the difference between social construction and physical construction is just what kind of structure we need to change in order to make a kind no longer salient. If a kind is socially constructed, then in order to make it irrelevant, in order for it to not be useful for scientific explanation, we need to modify social structures. If a kind is physically constructed, then we need to modify physical structures by, say, changing the temperature in order to make that kind or that property no longer relevant for scientific explanations. Okay. So there's a disanalogy here that I should point to. Race and viscosity don't play exactly analogous roles. Structures can be responsible to different degrees for the salience of properties or kinds. So racial kinds are almost irrelevant, entirely irrelevant to the scientific explanation. They serve as a kind of marker or a hook for the oppression to hang on. There's something different going on in viscosity, but I think this is a matter of the degree of responsibility of the structure. So social structures are more responsible for the salience of the properties than physical structures. So the physical structures in the viscosity case might be proportionately less responsible than social structures in the race case, but I don't think this undermines the disanalogy. In both cases, the constructed kind would be explanatory, irrelevant, in the absence of the appropriate structure. So the analogy is instructive. Okay. Now, look, I think this can be tied together into a way of thinking about emergence. So Du Bois says in this famous passage that at some point it dawned upon him with a certain suddenness that he was different from others, but he was like in many, many respects, but different from others. So I think this is emergent of race. All children are different from all other children in myriad ways. When Du Bois notes his difference dawned upon him, he means a certain specific difference is constructed by racism as more salient than the others. I've argued this is what's involved in the social construction of race. Some particular difference is marked out as a special kind of difference. It's constructed as relevant. Okay, so I want to grant the objections of critics, but defend social constructivism against them. So Garcia has claimed that there's something wrong with social constructivism. When we say that a subject S is a member of race R, we do not mean to state her social institutional role, to talk about her origin, so he's arguing for something like a populationist account of race. He maintains that we cannot make sense that being a member of a black race consists in social circumstance. He claims that something in him is responsible for his racial membership. Now, I don't want to go into that. I don't think that's right. I think there are many things wrong with Garcia's paper. But the claim that races are not socially constructed in the important sense they are not socially constituted, that I think is important. I think if we take social construction away from social constitution, then even someone like Garcia should acknowledge social constructivism. And it's important that he does, because it's importantly the case that many people see critiques of social constructivism as implicit endorsements of racialism. So we should rescue social constructivism from such critiques by showing that one can be a social constructivist and reject social constitution of certain kinds. Garcia's critiques of social construction can be granted, even though they shouldn't be perhaps, even while race is still considered to be socially constructed. So, an advantage of this account is social construction is naturalised. Races emerge in just the same way as other higher level physical properties. They needn't be thought of special. Social construction needn't be thought of as especially suspect. Social construction can nonetheless undermine racialist accounts. Thus, one can recognise the objections raised by those who think that socially defined race does not refer to the categories used in everyday language, while still accepting there is a meaningful sense in which race is socially constructed. So, and I think this is important, whether or not race is socially constructed is to a good degree independent of the metaphysics of race debate. I really look forward to hearing any questions or feedback or comments in the allocated session, and thanks for listening.